Congressman Roma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again for your testimony here this afternoon. And Ms. Schiavo, I hope you can stay with us for a little while. Your testimony is very intriguing and extremely interesting to us. Let me start with the whole concept here of your background. For those that don't know, you were appointed by President Bush, is that right?
That's correct, the first one.
The first President Bush, and the first President Clinton, if that's a term to use. I don't know if that's...
I guess we could
President
say that.
William Jefferson Clinton appointed you, or kept you in
one.
place at as the Inspector General at the Department of Transportation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you were there from 1990 to 1996.
That's also correct.
Okay. And we're going to hear a lot, I think, over the course of the next 12 months about actionable intelligence and strategic intelligence and predictive intelligence and maybe even prescriptive intelligence. Actionable intelligence, if it is what Mr. McHale might think it is that, Ms. Schiavo, when somebody says John Brown is going to bomb the Hoosier Dome in Indianapolis on August the 16th, 2004?
Well, that depends who you ask, and it was including the times that I was in the Department of Transportation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is the entity that makes the threat assessment and then provides the additional intelligence, which of course the FAA fans out to the airlines. But the difference in that, or the key in that statement, is the regulations, the security regulations, the operational effect at the airports and the airlines is not supposed to fall down to illegal levels, if I may say that, because frankly, when you don't meet the federal aviation regulations, you're operating illegally. And so the threat assessment was not supposed to be used to say, okay, today you really do have to do your job, as opposed to the other 364 days of the year when you can slough off, go to sleep, and hire felons to do your security. So I think one of the biggest problems we have, if everybody's talking about actionable intelligence, but for the levels that we're talking about at the airport, they aren't intelligence officers. And so I think in some ways it's a misnomer to get hung up on who said what to whom.
So warnings coming in, if I understand what you just said, warnings coming in can take all kinds of different variations. That can be threats overseas, it can be chatter in the intelligence, it can be something that happened in the Philippines or other places. Is that correct?
Sure.
So we could have information circulars and security directives triggered by these a little bit more vague activities that seem to be occurring more and more and more as we reach the spring and the summer of 2001. Is that correct?
Well, that's correct, and I think that you have seen that in the 15. For example, one was very specific about cell phones, and others were less specific, like people are training to hijack.
Let me get there. Let me then, with that in mind, back in 1994 and 1995, it was discovered that Osama bin Laden had a plot called the Bujinka plot that was discovered on a hardware drive in Manila that outlined the possibility of blowing up 12 airliners over the Pacific and also crashing a plane into Langley in the domestic United States. He also speculated about testing that and had a bomb on a plane that the bomb went off, the plane landed, I think one person was killed. You were in the Department of Transportation as IG at that point. Did you recommend any changes after that took place? Did this hit your radar screen? Did the government in the Department of Transportation do anything about this warning?
Actually, during that period of time, we did two major security reviews, and we made a number of recommendations. The first one resulted in congressional hearings in, I believe, 92 or 93. The second one resulted in hearings in 96. And so we had two ongoing overall reviews for that. And I will say that probably the sort of the highest level of attention still centered on events that were closer to home in terms of things that actually affected the United States. There was still a lot of work on the Pan Am aftermath, trying to get the Pan Am recommendations implemented, which some of them never did get implemented, and working on the build-up to the Atlanta Olympics.
So in your two major investigations, did anything change as a result of the attention that you brought to these deficiencies?
Temporarily, when we would investigate, when we would make these findings, and we were very similar to the gentleman you heard from yesterday from the Red Team. We did very similar work, and people would get sort of excited, and there'd be a level of enthusiasm. For example, we did it twice in 6 years, and then it would calm down, and people would sort of lose their drive. The big problem we had on our second major investigation is we learned later, and the extent of which I had only learned from some of Bogdan's testimony. The second investigation that we did probably was not as accurate as it could have been, because many of the airports were warned that we were incoming, including by the FAA. So some of that was compromised.
If I can fairly sum up what you've said, ephemeral, temporary changes, nothing that permanently would alter the way that somebody could exploit the system at that point.
In documentable statistical changes, they reverted quickly to their old patterns.
Let's start to jump ahead then to right into the spring of 2001 and the summer of 2001. I think Commissioner Benveniste and myself outlined a host of different intelligence discoveries by the intelligence community that started popping up through the next 5 or 6 years. Including the Los Angeles incident at the Millennium, where somebody was going to explode a bomb in the LA airport. Then we come into the spring, and there are 15 information circulars issued, and there are 5 security directives issued in a fairly compressed time period. Is this highly unusual, this number, 20? Is this standard? Give me some sense of how these people reading these kinds of security directives might be alarmed at this, or simply this is just standard operating procedure for them.
That's I mean, I don't call it chatter. I mean, that's a lot of information, and that's a lot of warnings. And, you know, I have some information that doesn't stem from my service in the government. For example, I mean, now obviously a lot of people call me with information because of the work that I do now. And for example, I have learned that there was some discussion, that there was extra attention, if you will, during that period of time. And there was a heightened I don't want to say alert, but there was, and chatter seems to be the word that everybody uses, so there was sort of a heightened chatter level, and things were going on. There was discussion about the situation in training, et cetera. But again, you got down to the problem of intelligence doesn't go to the lower level people who are supposed to be doing their jobs. So did that translate into operational success? Clearly not.
You mentioned in your testimony, in your written testimony on page 13 anyway, an August circular, and you mentioned the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, in this, and that she mentions the possible use of cell phones and keychains and pens as weapons and so forth. Is this something you cite because it happened at that time, or is this something that the National Security Advisor explained after September 11th?
No, I mean, and that happens to be one of the ones that I've seen. I mean, that was one of the warnings that went out during that time. The reason I use her summary from the news media is obviously, including in the litigation, we have not been able to get those warnings yet.
And what litigation are you involved in?
Our firm represents a number of the passenger families who perished on 9/11, and that litigation is proceeding in New York City.
And just to be clear for the record, how many people do you represent in that?
47.
47.
Only passengers.
You also mentioned in your testimony, you talk about citing information that credited FBI sources with respect to prepositioned weapons, a targeted fifth plane, the possession by terrorists of ramp passes, security badges, and pilot credentials. Is this information that you gathered from media accounts and media sources, or is this something that you got from other accounts? Can you be much more specific as to what you have evidence of here?
Right, certainly most of the things accredited to the FBI sources, as I mentioned, they were credited in public or media reports without persons' names attached to them.
Do you have anything else that you can add to that?
Again, the information that we have in the litigation has not come from actual litigation because so far the government has said it's sensitive security information, but I have talked to certain other witnesses, but in terms of actually getting the FBI reports, no, we do not. We do not have those reports.
You mentioned, and I think Mr. McHale mentioned red teams. I think Mr. McHale referred to them as covert teams or covert testing programs. We had a witness here yesterday that you call a hero in your written testimony. He is very critical of these red teams' performances, that the information doesn't get to the appropriate people, and he also went on to say that they're not aggressive at all now. I think it's fair to state, and not quoting him, but paraphrasing him, I think that's what he finally said. Do you think that these red teams are aggressive enough today to test the system thoroughly to make people feel safe?
Depends who their leader is and how much support they get. I had the same kinds of teams, and mine were very good, but they got very disillusioned, like Bogdan, because when you would see that the administration didn't respond to what you found, they got quite disillusioned. But we thought they were quite successful, and we, for the ones that I had, we got some really tremendous findings and located some vulnerabilities. I thought they were successful.
And how do you make sure, how do you ensure that these red teams are successful in the future? How do you, as an inspector general, is somewhat insulated in the system for very specific institutional reasons, how do you try to make sure that red teams have the autonomy to do their job well, to potentially embarrass people and get good results of weaknesses in the system without being punished for that?
Well,
where is the balance there? How did you achieve it in your tenure there?
Well, I rewarded those who did it. I mean, but I was criticized for that too. I was called the gotcha IG. So, I mean, I rewarded them. I liked it. They certainly weren't punished for making great findings, and they were rewarded for that. But I wasn't in the lineup of the FAA. I was an independent, had an independent organization. We didn't have to answer to the FAA, and technically not even to the Secretary of Transportation. So my employees were rewarded and remained, I think, pretty tough.
Well, again, I don't want to take up a lot of time. I want other commissioners to be able to ask some questions as well, too. But we appreciate your testimony, and I'll turn over the rest of that time to Commissioner Gordon.
Mr. McHale, you're welcome here, and I hope and trust that you can answer the widest range of questions. You won't be offended by our view that we really do need your boss. We need the Admiral. You've said that will be the case in the future, but I think I need to begin this by reminding you of that. We are going to need the number one person here. But I think you can probably answer most of the questions that I'm going to have. And I begin with this. What percentage or what number of boarding passengers have been, in the recent past, stopped because they were discovered with prohibited articles? Out of every 1,000 passengers, say, who attempt to board, how many are stopped and not just examined, but are actually found to have prohibited articles on their person?
We actually, I think I look at the number a little differently than that, because what we look at is the number of things that we recover. I'm not sure I have a specific per 1,000 passenger number for you, but we have recovered well in excess, almost I believe 2,000 firearms since we took over security. We've recovered hundreds of thousands of knives. We recover a lot of other kinds of prohibited items, some of which are greater or lesser threats.
But
hazardous
at this
material,
point, I'm
pepper
trying to
spray.
get at the psychology of that employee of yours who's doing this repetitively, you know, hour after hour, day after day.
I would say there are a significant number, even at a good busy checkpoint, there are multiple recoveries of prohibited items every day. Most of those are relatively small items, sharp objects, things like that. Firearms would be rarer, but at our major airports, every single one of our major airports makes multiple recoveries of firearms every year.
How many or what share of, say, the people who are stopped with some prohibited item are carrying something that is so serious or are otherwise regarded as serious enough security risks so that they're not permitted to board even after you've taken those articles away from them?
Well, usually, generally people who are carrying firearms or large knives generally are arrested, so they obviously don't proceed. People who are carrying smaller items that may have been overlooked in their packing or things like that generally are going to be treated as just the item will be taken and they will be allowed to proceed, although the airline is consulted on that. There may be instances where you have somebody who is tries to conceal the fact that they're carrying a prohibited item, even a small, relatively innocent prohibited item. With that kind of concealment, we will generally stop them, interview them. They may be arrested. They're almost certainly in that circumstance going to miss their flight, and it will be up to the airline whether they rebook them or not.
Well, let me again try to get you to be a little bit more
Okay.
precise. Out of every 1,000 or 100,000 boarding passengers, how many are arrested?
We have almost 2 million passengers a day, and we probably have 2 or 3 arrests a day. A little less
So-
than 2 million passengers a day.
So approaching,
It's
not
fairly-
much more than 1 in a million.
Yeah, right. hmm
And what is your, as sensitive as this question may be, what is your current estimate of the number of prohibited articles that you miss every day out of those almost 2 million passengers?
It's always very hard to estimate what you miss because you don't have it. We do some checking, continue to do gate screening recoveries.
Well,
We
you
do not
have your-
generally recover, we have actually rarely in those instances recovered larger items like large knives and guns, although we have recovered those after the checkpoint. There was a very well-known incident in New Orleans where that happened last year. But generally, the items that are recovered at the checkpoint are the smaller items. It is a small percentage of the, probably in the, I
Well,
don't know.
you have your checkers or your
Right.
red teams now
Right.
who are testing.
Now,
What's
yeah.
what's their share of success in getting away with what they're carrying in the way of prohibited items?
The red teams, we want the red teams to break the system.
I understand you do.
Right. So we send them out to break the system. And when their success rate drops below 50%, we tell them to get harder. We tell them to work harder at getting it through, find other ways to get the items into the system. That's their goal. So that's what we try to do with them. We try to find any possible way to get a prohibited item into the system.
All right, if
that we
your
learn.
goal for your red team is 50%.
Right.
Isn't it likely that 50% of
No.
those who are deliberately attempting to beat the system and have rehearsed for a while are not going to have the same degree of success?
They might. Our RID team, of course, understands the system probably better than any terrorist does, so they probably have an advantage over that. What we look at is we want to make it as hard as possible for somebody intentionally to get something into the system, basically so that it becomes almost impossible for them to plan to get something into the system. That way they'll go to another target. Also, I think the second thing and very important to point out here is screening is just one level of security.
Yeah,
That's
I will get to that at the moment. With respect to screening, however, is perfection attainable?
No.
How much closer to perfection do you think you can get?
We're going to try to get as close as we can. But it will never be perfect at all. There's no way it could be. It's a human. You have human factors. You have technology limitations, and you have the tremendous pressure of the crowd. As I mentioned, we have almost 1.8 million passengers a day. We have huge numbers of bags. So it's a huge job every day to screen those people. I think we have to strive for perfection, but I think we'd be fooling ourselves if we
I've
thought we'd get there.
spoken so far of passengers and the passenger checking. Could you give me comparable answers with respect to baggage checking? How much checked baggage do you stop because it has prohibited articles in them? And how successful are your tests in getting things through that system?
There are obviously far fewer prohibited items in checked baggage, in the sense of there are fewer items on the list of things that are prohibited. What we do recover occasionally are firearms that are in checked baggage that are not properly packed. You can pack a firearm in checked baggage if you do it correctly and notify the airline. We find several of those a day, and take action against the passenger if appropriate with law enforcement. We occasionally find things like pepper spray or mace, which are regarded as hazardous material and dangerous to put into checked baggage. We have not found any bombs. We've only been doing it for about 3 months.
Let me go to one other level, and I'd like you to describe what you think both the functions and the effectiveness of the Marshall system is. What share of flights now, whether of all flights or relatively long-distance flights in which an aircraft taking off has a large amount of fuel aboard, actually are protected by an onboard marshal?
We don't discuss in open session the deployment of the air marshals. I'd be happy to provide that in a classified form.
Okay.
I can tell you, though, that air marshals today, unlike prior to 9/11, fly both domestically and internationally, and we do cover a significant proportion of the flights.
Have there been any, and you can tell me whether this is classified as well, have there been any air marshal arrests or interdictions of what appeared to be, not passenger rage, but actual attempts at hijacking or destroying aircraft?
There have been arrests of passengers who were considered to be a potential threat. I would say that there have not been any, as far as I know, there have not been any attempts to hijack aircraft, U.S. domestic aircraft, since we've been out there. So I think I probably have to leave it at that.
Is TSA, or to what extent is TSA experimenting with or considering either additional or certain forms of profiling, and tell me what they are at one end, and at the other end, a trusted traveler program?
We're looking at, FAA has been using for years, really, I think since almost shortly after Pan Am 103, something called the CAPS 1 system. The CAPS system was called Computer Assisted Passenger Pre-Screening. It started off being used for baggage screening purposes, what bags should be screened, but it was expanded after 9/11 to help identify passengers. It's a bit of an old system. It's an old technology based on airline reservation systems, and frankly isn't up to the task that we needed to do today. We're replacing that over the summer with what we call CAPS 2. CAPS 2 is an intelligence-based system on the government computers. We'll use intelligence data basically to develop systems programs to help us identify patterns of terrorism and identify terrorists through that. It is not, however, a system that draws on racial profiling or anything like that. That's not really a very useful way to find terrorists. If you look today at the Jose Padillas and the Richard Reeds, that kind of ethnic profiling could well lead you in the wrong direction potentially. So we don't. That's not something that we really rely on. In terms of registered traveler, that is probably the way we look at that today. Is that will probably be a portion of somehow integrated into CAPS 2. Registered traveler system would give us an ability to do a background check on a passenger that would be far greater than anything we could do in the commercial environment in which CAPS has to operate. If we could get a significant level of confidence in that, it would help assure us that the passenger does not need to be subjected to additional security measures. But our expectation at this time is that we will always maintain a certain level of security screening for all passengers, regardless of whether they're registered.
What's the source of your intelligence for CAPS 2?
The intelligence community, the FBI, others, basically the entire intelligence community.
And is that a relationship with which you are comfortable, that you're getting what you need?
We have actually, we have a very good relationship today with the intelligence community. We have liaisons at all of the major agencies. Our people there, their people, some of their people with us. There's a tremendous flow of information. I was not at the FAA on September 11th. I came to DOT at the end of 2001. But talking to the people who work for me, who were there, my impression is that the flow of intelligence is far, far better today.
All of our questioning, both my questioning of you and the earlier questioning, has been directed at airline and aircraft security. But close to 90% of your money, as I understand it, goes into that form of transportation security, and
That's right.
more than half of that into screening.
That would be about right.
In your, at least long-range point of view, is that an appropriate division of your resources? Does it reflect the threat and the scope and seriousness of the threat when you take transportation safety, which is the name of your agency as a whole?
Transportation security. We do. The budget that we have, the division we have, is required to meet the legislative mandates that we have. But one of the things I addressed in my opening remarks was the need to bring balance to that, to bring balance to our very high payroll costs, to bring operational support, and a piece of that also is to free up part of our budget to drive it over to the other parts of our mission, to look at the other parts of the transportation system. Asking a government bureaucrat whether he wants more money is kind of like putting a kid in a candy store. I think the reality is always we could use more money, but we'll divide it up.
Yeah, but if you were not subject to congressional constraints and you had the amount of money that you did now, would you distribute it in the fashion that it is?
I'm not sure that we would reduce the amount of money we're spending on aviation security.
But you might use increases somewhat disproportionately for other forms.
That's correct.
Okay. General Steele, you were in at the beginning, in a very real sense, of facing these problems over the first 3 years. You've been an observer ever since, and you see Mr. McHale, who is in at the present time. Just in general terms, how effective and how dramatic, in your view, have the changes been? Given the nature and some of the changes in the threat, are we better off now than we were when you started? And if you just had one or two things to say we ought to have as immediate priorities, what would they be?
I'd be happy to answer that, Senator. First of all, I am not privy to the figures that are coming back from their testing, whether that be done electronically using the TIP system, which is both the training vehicle as well as it can be used to evaluate screener performance. I know what it was when I was there, but I don't know what they're getting. So how much better are they is a very, very good question. This much better? This much better? That much better? I don't know. I think instinctively everybody believes that the fact that they are federal employees and they have higher standards now they feel more comfortable about it than before it was the security companies. But they're the only ones who can really say that. From what I read, though, in the paper and when I stay close to it, I think they're still being penetrated too often, too easily, even by the press and others who are out there to evaluate or test the system and publicize it. So that bothers me. A few other things, if I may. I happen to be a believer in the CAPS system, but I was a believer in CAPS 1. The way that Mr. McHale has described CAPS 2, I'm not sanguine that it's going to be very successful. CAPS 1 was simply developed by the airlines based on information they had to separate the knowns from the unknowns. The president of the Ford Motor Company is a million-miler going through. We don't have to spend as much time on him. So it was a way to, the whole system moves with bags and people at about every 6 seconds. So if we can, it's a winnowing effect. If we can get the knowns through very, very quickly, that offers us an opportunity to spend more time on the unknown. And that's what that was about. That seems to have been reversed with CAPS 2, and now they're trying to identify a real threat out there, and I don't think there is any way to do that, frankly, without going into some very, very intrusive things, which I don't think our society is ever going to accept. I could go on to some other things on
Well, I asked you for your 2 highest priorities.
Well, is that the last question I'm going to get from the commission?
I don't think so.
Oh, 'cause I've got some views on a few
Good.
other
I've
things,
got a
on
couple
red teams
questions.
and that sort of thing as well. But I'll be happy to respond. I would like to make a point also. I think the questions about standards, are we going to get 100%? And of course, I agree with Mr. McHale's response. And I think you'll find everybody has said that, including the Chapter 8, as you look at Anne McLaughlin's report also. She stresses that point on national will. And I think everybody will say that. Even the security guys at El Al will tell you exactly the same thing. But on even the EDS, the automated explosive detection systems, none of those systems were designed, nor did we certify them to be 100%. We had to accept a probability detection rate less than that when we designed those. I won't give it to you exactly what it is, but I'm sure some of your staff will tell you. But none of it's designed to be 100%, even in our equipment.
McHale, I had one other, perhaps more philosophical question for you. How do you keep your screeners interested and alert
Right.
when 1 out of 1 million passengers is going to have a dangerous gun and be arrested for it? It just seems to me the job is so routine that to keep people alert constantly, when of course the only measure of their success is negative, that nothing bad happens.
Right. There's a lot of things
Deal with
that has been a concern of us, of all of us, I think, who've been in this business. It certainly has been a concern of us as we built this workforce and as we go forward. First of all, when we say 1 in a million, remember that we have almost 2 million people a day. So that's a lot of people going through the system. So you're right. It sounds like not much, but as General Steele said, it's really one person every 6 seconds going through some of these major checkpoints. It's not actually all that unusual to find something significant. But that's actually not what we rely on. What we rely on is every day we send out to all our airports as well as all our air marshal bases intelligence briefs. They are actually brought down to a very low level of classification, sensitive security information, so that they can be widely shared. but they identify things that have occurred around the world, or items that have been found at airports, or way things have been concealed, or other sorts of information, to let the people know every day that there is something, that things are happening out there, to remind them every day that this is in fact a real war that we're in, and it's an ongoing thing. We rely on our federal security directors, many of whom have extensive military or police or law enforcement experience, used to working with teams and motivating teams. Rely on them to motivate their screeners. And of course, we test. We test the system. Not only do we do the covert testing, but we have a more routine form of testing that goes on at all the airports. Plus, General Steele mentioned the TIP system, which is critical. It's one that we were challenged, frankly, to get it onto every explosive detection machine in the country as we went out last year and increased the production rate from 40 a year previously to over 1,000 last year. We are putting those on all the machines throughout this year, and our plan is to have those all hooked up so that we can download new images. The TIP system, just very briefly, if you don't know what it is a system that basically puts up a false image occasionally of a threat item in a kind of hidden way that's a little difficult to see, and it puts that up on the X-ray screen, and then we can actually measure how often our X-ray technicians, our X-ray screeners, actually identify that item. So that helps with X-ray screening, but we have to test all the other systems, the wanding. We have to recalibrate the metal detectors. So that is very important to us. It's a human engineering issue, and it's one that we work very hard to keep our people alert.
May I also just follow in on that, if I may, sir? The answer is, first of all, it's not in money.
Right.
The answer is in that, what we call the CSS, the supervisor. He's the key, or she is the key. And I found in the years that I was there, if that supervisor was good, you had a pretty strong defense. And conversely, and wasn't, why, then you could penetrate it. Do you remember the movie The Sands of Iwo Jima? And you remember Sergeant Stryker, who took these 12 young Marines and trained them and got them ready for the Battle of Iwo Jima. And what he did, and the coaching he did, and what he knew about the strengths and weaknesses of each one of those youngsters when they're around. What we need is a Sergeant Stryker at every one of our checkpoints whenever that checkpoint is open, who knows the people, knows them, who knows that when you put somebody on that screen, that you need to warm up. You go out and play tennis, you don't go out and just play tennis, you warm up. We do the same for the screeners. There are limits to how long they're found, but we found that, when they made their errors was when they first went on the machine. So you take your weak ones and you take it when you're not being surged, but kind of the slower times, put your weaker one on there, throw those test objects at them, train them, put the arm around the shoulder. That's get them trained up. And then conversely, just like we went to sea and you were at general quarters, you had a battle staff up on the bridge. During the surge times, you got the varsity back out, doing those things. That's the person who knows and can understand those rhythms is what we really need. And it takes a long time, and it's leadership. That's all it is, pure and simple. A lot of human factors work, which I hope you'll go into, is involved here. And we were really pushing it at the end, and particularly my last year was encouraging the air carriers, that's where you need to make your investment. And I would say TSA needs to follow through on that one. It's not money.
I couldn't agree more, and obviously that's what we do try to follow through on. We also move the people around too. We don't want to leave somebody on a task too long. That causes them to lose their edge. If you leave them at the X-ray machine for hour after hour, so we rotate them around, try to encourage them. And I think one last thing though that's important is you also do need experience. And one of the problems that we found, we managed the contract screening operation for about 6 months before we brought out the federal screeners, from February until almost November. And one of the problems we found was whenever there was any testing that revealed that an item got through the checkpoint, the screeners were all fired who were responsible for it. And that became kind of the expected thing. Something gets through the checkpoint, fire the screener. One of the things we've tried to do is look at this as a system. It's not, if something gets through the checkpoint that shouldn't have got through the checkpoint, we need to look at the entire system. Was the X-ray machine calibrated correctly? Was the metal detector calibrated correctly? Is our training good enough? What are we doing? What are we doing wrong? What is it? I mean, obviously, if the screener's asleep, we're going to fire the screener. But that's not. But I think there was a reaction certainly in the time after 9/11 and in the sort of very immediately after 9/11. And I don't know what was before. That was every time there was a lapse at the checkpoint, you fired the screener. The result of that was you ended up firing a lot of experienced people and not necessarily getting to the real root cause of the problem. So that's something else we look at very hard.
I found that women, for example, senior women were absolutely the best screeners. Is something in their pattern? I don't know if it's in their pattern analysis, something that they do, but they could pick. They found things that I looked at that pic. I would have looked at it for a million years and never seen anything, but they could pick it out in an instant. I don't know why it is, but those are little tips, the things that you learn over time. Not all of them, but they also had great ability to concentrate. And that's what you need, is somebody who is concentrating that time they're on those machines. Conversely, they may not like to be the public, so that's not the person to put out and hand wand or anybody else. Those are the little things,
Mr. Chairman, could I I want to, just as General Steele took us back to Sergeant Stryker, let me take us back for just an instant to CAPS 2.
Yes, sir.
We constantly hear this balance between civil liberties and civil rights and the security needs in this new terrorist world. You mentioned that in CAPS 2 we might be working with your liaison, which you feel is strong, at CIA and FBI. We've just read reports recently that the FBI has new powers to occasionally be able to go to libraries and check up on what people are reading. We understand that the CIA may be running the TTIC, the Terrorist Threat Assessment Integration Center. In light of this, and in light of Americans' concerns about this, can you be more specific as to what CAPS 2 is going to be looking at? Are we talking about watch listing information? Are we talking about private sector databases? Are we talking about law enforcement information? Exactly what are we talking about, Mr. McHale?
I can't be too specific in an open forum, but again, that's something we can provide to the commission if appropriate. But let me just say,
can you be vague?
I can be vaguely specific.
And I'd be very interested in the follow-up on this in private.
Right. Sure. We're checking all sorts of databases. We're checking public and we're checking private databases to get a sense of what we have. But the system is actually designed. It's been designed actually in a lot of consultation with the privacy groups, and in fact, although we the technical term is ping. Although we ping off the public databases, to run some of these algorithms and things, we do not actually get that private data into a government computer database. We do not build a database with CAPS 2. So I think I need it's actually quite an interesting and complicated system to explain. It's very hard to do it here.
Well,
but
yes, I think we should do this.
It's important for you to understand that.
And it's important for the American people to understand the debate on some of this as well, too.
That's correct. There's obviously going to be debate and discussion of this, but we are very, very sensitive to the privacy side of this, and frankly, that's something that's important. I'd just like very briefly to address something that General Steele suggested. We actually also see CAPS 2 as a system for focusing our resources, and really a large part of what it will do is identify the vast majority of people who should just move quickly through security, and that's really what it does. But then it works your way down to a point where you also get some red flags up as people who need considerably more scrutiny.
My last question, General Steele, I love testimony that is futuristic and challenges us to look at threats 10 years from now. On page 7 of your testimony, you outline 4, and you look at such things as the shoulder-launched missiles and a coordinated terror campaign against cargo flights using smaller bombs. You talk about driving a car or a truck up to a terminal and exploding it. Congress at some point, as we heard yesterday, is going to say to us, we have limited resources. We don't have all the money in the world to fund every one of your recommendations, whether it be screening, ports, airports, outside terminals for cars, equipping airliners with the necessary defensive mechanisms for a shoulder-fired missile. Specifically, how would you prioritize a future threat in this industry, but maybe other threats in other industries that we're going to have to look at? Look broader than just the industry that you're here to talk to us about, and anticipate what we're going to be faced with in 12 months, recommending to Congress how they try to spend resources on the most likely threats across the board.
Well, despite the dramatic events of 9/11, I still believe the weapon of choice and the one that is really the most difficult to defeat, is still a improvised explosive device, probably in checked baggage, given the number of checked bags that pass through the system every day, and the fact that there are bombers, very artful bombers out there, who can make those almost undetectable, and without some sort of a person, but an automated system that would alert us to it. And so until we really have those out there deployed, and not only here, but also, as I mentioned in my statement, abroad, because we've got to have parallel systems over there. All we're going to do is squeeze the bubble here and it'll pop out over there. I think that is really the most important, and then also containers. We really need to get some containers. They were doing it, it was coming online when I was there in '91. We pushed it further, and we still don't have any deployed except for a few out there as test cases. We need to get busy on that and to hold that. But we must also know, and you know, Mr. Romer especially, that once you close out one avenue, then there'll be a new threat vector, as sure as anything. For example, when they talk about future threats, in our profiles and what we were seeking on passengers, it used to be a male, and particularly from an Arab nation at a certain age and everything else, excluding females. Now, from what we just now see coming out of the Middle East, we have to include the females, don't we? We can't exclude those. That's an example. We started thinking in my last year there that, listen, we were going to have EDS out there someday. And what are they going to do? And what we were already seeing was an emerging threat of manpads or surface-to-air missiles that we were receiving out of places like Athens. They had knocked down a couple of airplanes in Africa, cargo, not commercial. And clearly that was going to be kind of on the horizon, particularly when we closed that avenue, and we had to start, at least intellectually, beginning to figure out what we were going to do. So I still think that is the greatest threat. I think the cargo business is more kind of nuisance, panic, smaller bombs that we may have to face out there, not catastrophic loss of an airplane necessarily, but just to tell the American people this is, we're still capable of doing this at a fairly low risk a way of introducing something.
Senator Glenn.
Mr. McHale, I have a question that came here from a Senate office. It's really quite interesting. What percentage of mid and senior level staff at TSA have actually worked physical security at an airport?
I don't have a percentage for you. Quite a few at different places and different places. Our federal security director in Phoenix is the former head of the Phoenix police unit that ran that. Our federal security director that ran the airport unit. Our federal security director in Seattle is a former employee of the FAA Civil Aviation Security. We have a lot of people who have got military security backgrounds. Some of them were in the process where provided air-based type security. We have a lot of people with security backgrounds and law enforcement backgrounds. I don't have a specific percentage for you on that.
I had one question. Just a question, I guess, that the public, I think, is interested in. The people who go through airports a lot see certain people pulled out of line. We had witnesses yesterday who said what we should be really concentrating on is people, not things, and indicated, I gather, a form of profiling is what we should be after now. Well, right now we're pulling out grandmothers and grandfathers and teenage girls and people who it is very hard to conceive of any threat. I've been pulled out a couple of times, but maybe I fit something. but what is it? I mean, people are interested. Why are these people pulled out who look like no threat whatsoever?
Two reasons. One is the CAPS one system does, and also some of the watch lists have the CAPS one system does result in a fairly high number of false positives. Plus, you also have the watch lists have a lot of common names on it. The third most normal reason people are pulled out is because there may be some sort of alarm or some sort of indication they're not sure what's in the bag or whatever it is. We need to remember that terrorists have used dupes. Perhaps the most famous one was the Irish tourist in Israel who became pregnant and whose Palestinian fiance hid a bomb in her checked baggage, and luckily the Israeli security agents who talked to her uncovered that. That's a very famous story, but it's one that reminds us that dupes are out there, and we see that quite frequently as a fairly common potential tactic. Also, there is no easy, ready profile of the terrorist. You need to look at a variety of things. In Israel, there have been 65-year-old suicide bombers. So we need to think about all of that. We've had the IRA used to smuggle explosives in the bottom of children's strollers under sleeping babies. So we cannot fall asleep. We need to look at a wide range of things. But do we pull over too many grandmothers and too many kids? Yes. Yeah.
Last question from Secretary Lehman.
Well, you stole my thunder on that one because
Sorry.
I thought that was one of the most telling things that came out of yesterday's testimony, that it's all very well we have to concentrate on counting things and metrics and things that are measurable and x-raying and so forth, but we have been overlooking, and I agree with Mr. Mays, the industry spokesman, who made this point. We've got to look at people, and as another witness yesterday was pointing out, it's the other side of the coin that General Steele was saying on the people on our side of the fence. You've got to look at the human being and people that fit a profile, not because the computer spits them out, although that you can use that too, but because if there is a young Arab, male or female, and a little old lady from Pasadena, you pick the Arab to pull aside and talk to him as a human being, not measure him or see if he's carrying a knife, because as the point was made, an effective, well-trained terrorist doesn't need a knife, doesn't need a box cutter. So it worries me. Your testimony, Mr. McHale, worries me that the system is once again falling prey to the metrics, the fallacy of metrics, as opposed to the human factor that General Steele was.
Well, I think a lot of the testimony, my testimony certainly, and the questions I've answered, but just listening to the testimony and reading some of the reports from yesterday's testimony often focuses on the screening checkpoint and the screeners and what they do. And I think that gives you a false impression of what aviation security is all about. It is perimeters within perimeters. We have intelligence. We have intelligence reporting. They tell us what to look for. We have airport police are trained in surveillance detection. Our federal air marshals are trained in surveillance detection, looking at people who may well be planning or surveilling an airport. We deal with obviously the checkpoints. We try to train our people about what to look for. In addition to that, we have obviously the air marshals. We have the hardened cockpit doors today that are hard to get through. Frankly, we have the passengers. Somebody referred to that earlier today, and I think we have to recognize that the passengers themselves are a part of our security. And then we have the armed pilots. We have what I regard this as is a series of hurdles. I think if you look at security as a series of hurdles going all the way out to the farthest reaches of the intelligence community, including the movement of money. At some point, a terrorist must pop up over those hurdles. And our hope in security is that we catch them when they pop over one of those hurdles. No one hurdle is going to be enough. You have to have a whole system, you have to work it as a whole system, and keep the bad guys off the planes.
How can you assure us that the system you have, which sounds very good in description, isn't just as toothless as the system that preceded it, which we heard from witness after witness, really had no teeth? Fines ended up being a tenth of what was assessed. Lobbying pressures prevented the issuing of rules. Things like the locked doors went into the memory hole over time. What teeth do you have that FAA didn't have before 9/11?
I think the best thing that we have is people, and people who are reminded and remember 9/11. That is ultimately what it's going to be about.
So you don't have any more teeth.
Well, we have more teeth. I mean, we have our, we have a lot more federal presence. We have very good, very senior people who are the heads of security at all our major airports.
So what I'm talking about is enforcement. When you, as we've said, you've got to keep the industry as
Right.
as an essential
Right.
partner.
We've
If after things settle down, hopefully, and there are no more incidents, a couple of years go by, just like after the 95 and the Pan Am 103, the doors start swinging open again, people start forgetting, and even though the red teams, and my last question, I know you want to talk about red teams because you made a great reputation as being very aggressive when you were there and very effective with the kind of red team approach. But there has been no real teeth in enforcing people who get negligent. I'm not talking about the people that work for TSA. I'm talking about the industry, the airport people. How are you going to put the fear of God in them that if they get complacent or they talk themselves into thinking that something's not cost effective, therefore we don't have to pay attention to it?
Well, I'm not actually all that familiar with what the teeth were of the FAA before. So let me tell you what our teeth are, and then you can decide whether we have more. I do know that the civil penalties have been increased, that we can assess. The amounts of those penalties have been increased, but they're still $25,000 per violation for an air carrier and $10,000 per violation for a passenger. You can actually pick up a lot of violations if you go after somebody. But in addition to that, we do have the authority given to the administrator by the Aviation and Transportation Security Act to prohibit a flight coming into the United States. We have turned flights around. We have done significant amount of reverse screening. We have delayed flights. We have dumped passengers off flights for rescreening if appropriate. There are a lot of different things we can do. I can tell you, when you have a breach of a concourse and you dump the entire concourse to rescreen all the passengers, that is a multi-million-dollar impact on the airline if it's a big concourse. So there are a lot, and we've done a lot of that. I mean, there's a lot of those kinds of things. I do not know the extent to which FAA had all those things available to them or used them in the past.
General Steele, red teams.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Also, let me just clarify something that Mary Schiavo said. She talked about her red teams. I don't think she understood. She didn't have red teams. She was the IG, and she had inspectors. But they were not the red teams that we had, which were really former counterintelligence people, lots of experience in the field, who used all the guile and everything else, which made it even more embarrassing when her inspectors were able to penetrate. But nevertheless, there really weren't, in the sense of the word, red teams who were going out to really evaluate the system and give you an honest answer. My view is that, yes, certainly, TSA needs its red teams to be able to give feedback on equipment buys, policy decisions, and that sort of thing. But you also need, and I think perhaps and I've given this a lot of thought, and I want you to know that it's a serious proposal. In fact, I started thinking about it when the two House bill and the Senate bill were out there, and you remember the House bill still kept the private sector versus the large number of people. My feeling was then you did not probably have to create a huge new workforce of federal people, that you could probably still use the system, but to build in it a very, very robust red team capability that ought to be not only just aviation, but probably all modes of transportation. And I would maybe put it under the Secretary of Home Security versus the TSA. In other words, a more independent view. You would still need strict protocols. This is not cowboy stuff. I mean, you've got to keep them tight, and you'd probably have to rotate them around. But you would send them out to evaluate, let's say, an airport, and if in their findings that there are serious gaps, and particularly if more than 2 or even 3 layers had failed and continued to fail, and that becomes kind of a consistent report, then that secretary, it would have to be a cabinet officer, notifies the Secretary of Transportation that you either get that fixed in 48 hours or we're shutting you down. And you will shut down maybe perhaps that terminal, perhaps that entire airport, or perhaps that cargo area, or maybe an airline. But that's the time you've got to get it fixed, and we'll be back. And then you do it. And, you know, in my former life as a Marine, I learned the lesson early that there's no lesson in the second kick of a mule. There's a lesson in the first one. But this beast has kicked us now a couple of times and swiped at us a couple of other times. And I'm really hoping that your commission is going to be able to get a hobble around it this time. And I offer that as a very constructive means of doing this. We do this, you know, internationally. Did you know? I mean, if you look at the Foreign Airport Assessment Act, and we had we didn't do it in quite such a dramatic way, but we have a means where our inspectors, the TSA inspectors today, find the airport in Athens, for example, not meeting the ICAO minimum standards on one of their inspections, then the Secretary of Transportation issues a warning through the State Department that they've got 90 days to get that, and that we'll work with them. And we did this a number of times. I was there in Bogota. We did it in Barcelona before the Olympics, because they were doing a lot of construction and the place leaked like a sieve. You've got reason, and then you do work with them, and they got 90 days. And if they pull up their socks and earnestly pull that in there, then you may or may not. If they don't, then advisories start going out, and then the Secretary of Transportation says, no U.S. airplane will fly into your airport. Boy, that gets them busy. So there are incentives for doing that, and it can't be just done arbitrarily, and it's got to be kind of worked out. But I think we're at that point right now. And it's got to be done at the highest level because we know the cost. But I think that would be a terrific way to be able to kind of keep this complacency from coming back.
A terrific recommendation.